What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the sequels to original games that I loved, frankly, a lot more. The recent launch of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 has reminded me of the mini-games that have improved upon their rocky starts, so to speak, games that had issues but were otherwise really fun to play on some level, only to then be followed up by a sequel that, in my eyes, was, simply put, a much better experience. Now, I've talked about sequels on the channel a few times, basically how, going into a sequel, your own expectations of what that sequel should be in terms of what it improves, what it expands, what it reins in, etc. is largely going to dictate your experience with that game, because you have an idea of what that thing is, in most cases anyway, when you go into that game. Now, there are exceptions to this, obviously. Franchises like, say, Final Fantasy, where each entry is really only loosely connected via the universe, but otherwise not really at all. But even there, you still have expectations of what those games would be or are. So more often than not, what I enjoy about these sequels is typically that they've exceeded my expectations in some way, while also just improving on what I enjoyed about the original to begin with. And since I've reviewed a lot of games, there have been multiple instances of that over the years, and with Avowed upcoming, I think it's best to start with Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. So Deadfire is a game that, to my mind, largely improves on the original in basically every way. And while there are certainly going to be people who enjoy the story of the first game much more, I think most people pretty well agree that Deadfire is mechanically a much more interesting game. For starters, you have things like multi-classing, but even more than that, you can also do simple things like look ahead to see what your abilities will be at certain levels. Pillars of Eternity, the original game, being one of those games that rode that Kickstarter wave into the CRPG renaissance we have today, unfortunately, at that time lacked a lot of, quality of life features. Things like, being able to see what's upcoming in terms of your level. And even little more subtle stuff you probably wouldn't even notice unless you're playing a ton, like the ability to retarget a spell you've already started to cast is something you can do in Deadfire. And that's to completely ignore the much more explorable world that is also available in Deadfire, the ship system, and while things like the actual ship combat weren't exactly loved, there's just so much interesting stuff to see and do that really expands the world of the Deadfire archipelago, and while not all of it is perfect by any means, it's a game that in my opinion thoroughly outclasses its original entry. And second on the list, the game that inspired the list to begin with, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. So I got onto this train a little bit late, in the sense that I initially reviewed the first Kingdom Come Deliverance recent-ish in 2023, actually. And while I generally enjoyed it quite a bit because it reminded me of Oblivion with all its weird janky systems, it was nonetheless a game with some obvious pain points that even the sequel doesn't entirely alleviate, like the save system that I'm just never going to be a fan of. But in spite of that, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 went on to, at the very least, take a look at a lot of those systems and refine them, while also adding handy quality of life features and simple stuff like the outfit system, keeping you from constantly having to, swap between different sets of clothing for different situations as the game calls for them, like, dark light clothing for stealth or heavy plate armor for melee combat. You had to manually switch those in the original, whereas you can set up outfits in the second one, and that's to say nothing of better tutorialization and even a proper ending to the main story of the first game, which never really got a proper conclusion. So for a million reasons, I very much so enjoyed the second Kingdom Come Deliverance more so than the first. But honestly, the first is still pretty good. You should check it out, as there's something about going from a lowly peasant who doesn't even know how to read to somebody dominating the landscape, which is really fun. But nonetheless, we are on to our third entry. Now this one is sure to be controversial, which is BioShock 2. So of the BioShock trilogy, 2 wound up being my favorite. Now I will grant people, I do think that the first game probably has the better overall story, but BioShock 2 improves upon the gameplay so much while also still having an interesting story that for me it's just the better game all around. Because honestly, just the ability to put a plasmid or a power in one hand and your weapon in the other makes for a much more satisfying game experience all on its own. And putting you in the role of a big daddy protecting the little sister was honestly a really brilliant move. So while unfortunately the remaster is having some technical issues over on Steam these days, it is still, to my mind, the best BioShock game, because Infinite is more of an on-the-rails shooter that kind of felt like a step back in some ways, and the first BioShock was just just a little too clunky in comparison to the second one. So for my money, BioShock 2 was the best one. Honestly though, in a very similar vein, we then have Dishonored 2. While I would say Dishonored 1 probably indeed has a mostly better story, Dishonored 2 is frankly just a better gameplay experience, not least of which because it gives you the option between our two different protagonists, Corvo or Emily of course, each with their own set of powers which can either feel familiar with Corvo or a little different with Emily, and each of them offering a different gameplay experience as a result, but also just some incredibly well-designed levels, some really interesting places to explore and utilize all of your various powers in order to blitz your way through this game. And that's before you even start acknowledging the more immersive sim elements and all the crazy things you can get up to that are well documented in YouTube videos at this point. So while both of these games are really great, Dishonored 2 is really the one that stuck with me the most. And then to wrap up this video, we have our final entry of Divinity Original Sin 2. Now, as I've mentioned many times, the Divinity series is near and dear to me. It's one of the first games that I covered extensively. Playing Original Sin 2 sort of reignited my love for the genre and ultimately led to this YouTube channel being what it is today, even before Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. And it just so happens that Original Sin 2 has so thoroughly outclassed Original Sin 1 that almost nobody talks about that one anymore, so this one probably isn't much of a surprise, but having 100% both of them, while I enjoy Original Sin, you can tell it's more of like a rough draft for what was to come in Original Sin 2, not least of which in how it lets the player run around, explore, and try out various options to get through any given situation, as opposed to Original Sin 1's pretty rigid sort of level system, where there really was sort of like a correct way to go through the game via a certain level if you weren't just outright exploiting things, meaning that each section of its little map had basically one level here, level 2 there, level 3 here, that kind of thing, and if you were even one level off, it makes a huge difference in that game, and honestly it didn't feel great given the type of experience they were trying to craft, and that's before you even talk about how that narratively I think they hit their stride much more in 2 as well. I think 2 is a much better written game with much more interesting characters, because even the returning characters, which are almost 1,000 years apart, manage to be more interesting there. And then there's, of course, all the changes to the combat system, which were mostly better. I think, the physical magic armor system is never going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it never bothered me personally. And while Original Sin 2 has problems, I think, with the way it scales items, as an example, and even in how it rewards finding a non-combat solution, as another example, that is to say it rarely rewards it at all, it is still, nonetheless, for me at least, a game that is just pretty much top to bottom better than the original, which is why I wanted to mention it last, though I do think that is where we will wrap up this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I would love to know about sequels you love down in the comments section below, as I'm sure honestly there are a million more, but these are the ones that came to mind for me. But naturally, that of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.